Hello, my name is Arnaud Soulier and I teach ICS cybersecurity. Today, I want to talk about a very classical topic in cybersecurity, security patching, but in the context of industrial control systems. Security patching refers to the regular action of applying a new version of the software or the firmware that you run on your component in order to fix security vulnerabilities. Security vulnerabilities are identified all the time, sometimes directly by the manufacturer, sometimes by security researchers. And so the manufacturer develops a new version of the software and shares it with the clients that has to apply it in order to be more secure. That's the whole concept. However, in ICS environments, it's a bit more complex than that. It's quite complex to apply the security patches. And today I want to discuss what is the importance of security patching in ICS. And first, we will discuss the first component is how hard is it to apply security patches? What are the difficulties? Well, first, in order to apply a security patch, you have to be aware of the patch and you need a full asset inventory in order to know that, okay, I have this PLC in version 2.2, so I am vulnerable to this new vulnerability and I need to apply the patch. This is something that the most mature environments have, but not all my clients have detailed inventory. So that's the first obstacle, is knowing exactly what you have on your network. Secondly, in order to apply a security patch, you need to have a device that are supported by the manufacturer or the vendor. A lot of ICS environments run with some obsolete devices. ICS components, they are quite costly, and so when they are installed, they are usually used for a long period of time. 10 years, 20, 30. I've seen PLC that were almost 40 years old, still working in some environments. So of course, after 40 years, the manufacturer will not send you a firmware update for security vulnerabilities. So that's another obstacle, is the widespread use of obsolete components. And if you go a bit more into the details, sometimes you may also have supported devices, like a PLC, it's still supported, but you run it in a very old version of the firmware. So if there is a security vulnerability identified, maybe the manufacturer will provide a fix for the firmware versions 4 and 5, but not for the firmware version 1. And so if you run this old version and you want to apply the patch, you will have to do an upgrade to the latest version of the firmware. And while moving from a version 1 to version 1.1 is a minor revision, so there's, I would say, a low risk of change that will break your process. Upgrading from version 1 to the latest one, to version 5, well, there might be additional impact and additional changes that will impact your environment. So it's a bit more difficult. So that's also an issue. So there's obsolescence for the whole component, but also obsolescence for the specific version of the software or the firmware that you use. Of course, the next topic would be to say, okay, should I apply the patch? So that's also a difficult activity. Most of the time we rely on CVSS score, mostly in IT, to know if the vulnerability is worth patching or not. In ICS, unless you are a professional dedicated to this topic, it's quite difficult for an asset owner or for automation engineers to understand, well, what's the impact of this vulnerability? And so it will be very time consuming to take a look at all the vulnerabilities and identify if it's worth patching or not. On this very topic, I will have a following video introducing a new methodology, but that's also a big obstacle to security patching. It's the lack of time to identify if the patch should be applied or not. Then, let's say that you have your asset inventory, you run the latest version of the firmware, the patch is important, and you want to patch. Then comes the real difficulties, because applying a security patch to a PLC or a SCADA software means to some extent shutting down the process, or at least a part of the process. And of course, in industrial environments, that's not something that you do lightly. It means a earning less money. It means finding the right time frame to do the patch. And that's very, very complex. Depending on the industries, some industries work in batch and it's a little bit easier to find the right time to patch, but some industries have continuous processes, and so it's very difficult to be able to apply the patch. You will have very limited time frames, maybe once a year, where you can apply the patch. So that's a major difficulty. It's the need to reboot the PLC, and if you reboot a PLC, of course, it's not able to manage the sensors and the actuators, so you cannot run the process without the PLCs. So it's just impossible to do it without impacting the production. And another point is that there is no testing environment most of the time in ICS. So in IT, you will have virtual machines and you will apply the patch. If it doesn't work, you just revert to the previous snapshot and everything's fine. Well, in ICS, most of the devices, they are hardware based, especially the PLC and other low-level devices. And so if you update the firmware, you will do it directly in production. And so the testing has to be done in production, which extends the time frame you need to do the patching, because it's not only patching, it's just not 10 minutes to update the firmware and then we are done. It's 10 minutes to update the firmware. Then you have to make sure that the sequences that you program in the PLC, they still work as expected. So that's, I would say, another obstacle to security patching. So overall, we cannot say it's a light activity. Security patching requires a lot of dedication, a lot of workload, and so a lot of investment. On the other side, what's the real-life risk reduction of patching those ICS-specific components? Well, first element, thankfully, we have only a very limited number of successful attacks on ICS systems. And none of them relied on exploiting a vulnerability for which a patch was available but not installed. I would say that the overall security level of ICS systems at the moment makes it possible for an attacker to have an impact on the process without requiring to exploit a specific vulnerability in a PLC or in the SCADA software. So that's the first element. We do not have hard evidence in attacks that those problems were ever exploited. Secondly, in my experience doing security assessment, most of the security features of PLCs and ICS-specific software, they are used, I would like to say never, but that's probably not true, but on very rare occasions, I've been able to see a PLC correctly hardened and secure. Most of the time, even the newest PLC that have a lot of security features, they're just installed as is without configuring all those new fancy security features. Which means that if you want to install a security patch that will fix a bypass of a security feature, but you do not use this security feature, it's a bit useless to apply this patch. And in my opinion, for most of the clients, applying the patch will actually result in not improving the cybersecurity, since you do not use the security features that are vulnerable. Okay, so that's a big problem. And more globally, I also want to talk about a topic that I like. It's called forever days. It's a bit like the opposite of a 0 day. So a 0 day is a vulnerability that has been identified and for which there is no patch yet. The vendor will work on a patch, but at the moment, the vulnerability is identified and there is no patch. Forever day, it's kind of the same. The vulnerability is identified, but you know that there won't be a patch. There will never be a patch simply because this vulnerability is kind of like a feature, and so it will stay forever. Like in PLC, we can think about using unsecure protocols like Modbus. Modbus by design doesn't has any security feature, so that means that you cannot provide a patch for Modbus, and even some PLC manufacturers, they have UMAS protocol extension to Modbus to perform administrative tasks on PLC without any kind of authentication. So the question is it really worth it applying a security patch to fix a XSS vulnerability in the web interface while on the other hand, I know that my device still use Modbus for administrative tasks. And so if the attacker is already on my network, will the attacker try to exploit the XSS vulnerability, or will he try to use the Modbus feature that is there forever? Well, I know what I would do. So overall, the real life risk reduction of most ICS security patches is quite limited. So in conclusion, patching is very complex, very costly, huge investment, and on the other hand, it provides a very limited risk reduction. So security patching shouldn't be your top priority in ICS. Of course, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't patch anything. Definitely there are some action required, but you should patch wisely by specifically choosing the right devices that you want to patch, the ones that are the most exposed, I would say, and only for the vulnerabilities that have a real impact on the cybersecurity level of your ICS. I will detail a new methodology to select which patches to apply and which patches to not apply in the following video. Thanks for joining and see you soon.